Hello and welcome to Byju's IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper. There are 3 articles in today's newspaper that refer to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on global oil prices and its impact on India's energy security. Apart from this article on page number 1, we have an article on page number 9 which carries an interview with Union Minister Dharmendra Pradhan, who holds the petroleum and natural gas portfolio. Then we have another article on page number 15 that refers to the impact of the lockdown on crude oil processing in India. So let us club these 3 articles together and understand the impact of the pandemic on global oil prices and how it is affecting the pricing of oil in India and India's energy security. See, over the last 3 months, the pandemic has led to a lot of volatility in global oil prices, and there are 2 reasons responsible for it. One is the pricing wars between major oil producing countries that are a part of the OPEC Plus grouping, and 2 is the drastic fall in global demand for oil as a result of lockdowns that were imposed by governments around the world. Over a month ago, we had discussed in detail how global oil prices had hit a historic low, and a key oil pricing index known as the West Texas Intermediate had crashed into the negative territory for its May futures contract. At a time when global demand for oil was falling drastically as a result of the pandemic and the lockdown around the world, key oil producing countries such as Saudi Arabia and Russia that are a part of OPEC Plus, they engaged in a pricing war leading to increase in supply from both the sides. So at a time when demand was falling as a result of the pandemic and the lockdown, supply was increased by the OPEC Plus group, especially by Saudi Arabia and Russia, which led us to a situation where the world was running out of storage space to store the crude oil. As a result of these unprecedented developments, global oil prices crashed and the WTI index crashed into the negative territory. In fact, the impact of the lockdown has been so severe on India as well, because India has seen the biggest drop in crude oil processing since 2003 as a result of the lockdown. According to data made available by oil refiners, for the month of April, crude oil processing in India went down by a massive 28.8%. This has to be the biggest fall in India's crude oil processing since 2003, and it has forced oil refiners to cut production. The data that has been made available by oil refiners, government agencies, and independent agencies have shown that as a result of the lockdown and travel restrictions imposed by the government in order to contain the COVID-19 pandemic, demand for oil consumption in India fell by a massive 45.8%. So this fall in demand has forced oil refiners to cut production and also to put a stop on oil imports. Because even India's oil refiners are running out of storage space, and they have even been forced to sell the excess oil to the central government, which has capitalized on the crisis to fill up its strategic reserves at a cheaper cost. Despite this decline in global oil prices, Indian customers are still paying a very high price in the domestic market. In fact, Indian citizens are paying nearly 3 times the actual price, and this is because a large part of the pricing component is made up of government taxes. The central government and the state governments, they impose a variety of taxes on petrol and diesel that includes excise duty imposed by the center and VAT imposed by state governments, and this makes oil nearly 3 times costlier than its actual price. This money collected by the central government and the state governments is a key part of their revenue, and hence the central government has said that it is not going to reduce the taxes even though there has been a massive fall in global oil prices, because this part of the government's revenue is critical to sponsor various welfare programs, especially at a time when the pandemic is having a disproportionate impact on the weaker sections. So in the coming days, we can expect domestic oil prices to remain high even though global oil prices have fallen. But in the medium term, the relaxation of lockdown restrictions around the world is expected to stabilize demand and therefore stabilize the global oil prices as well. So the central government has said that it would like to capitalize on this opportunity when global oil prices are low and generate more revenue in order to sponsor more welfare programs by imposing higher taxes on oil products. So until the global oil prices stabilize as a result of the relaxation of lockdown restrictions, the government has a window to generate additional revenue to sponsor welfare programs. Next, the interview with Union Minister Dharmendra Pradhan helps us understand the vulnerability of India's energy security to external supply shocks and what India is doing to become more resilient to such disruptions in crude supplies? See, as we all know, India's energy security is largely dependent on oil imports. Due to the limited availability of oil resources in India, India's energy security is heavily dependent on imports. In fact, India's import dependency is so high that nearly 85% of India's oil requirements is imported. So this excessive import dependency makes India's energy security vulnerable to external supply shocks that are most likely a result of geopolitical factors. See, traditionally, a large part of India's oil imports has come from the West Asia Middle East region. This includes suppliers such as Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Bahrain, Oman, etc. But the constant volatility and tensions in the West Asia Middle East region has the potential to disrupt crude oil supplies to India and directly affect India's energy security. See, a number of key oil producing countries in the Middle East, they suffer from political instability. For example, Iraq is a key supplier to India, but political instability in the country directly has a bearing on the supply of crude oil to India. The region is also affected by a number of civil wars and conflicts, such as the Israel-Palestine conflict, the Syrian civil war, the civil war in Yemen, etc. The region is also heavily affected by terrorism and proxy wars, which in turn affects the supply and prices of oil that is exported from this region. Recently, for example, the Houthi rebels of Yemen carried out a major terror attack using drones against Aramco's oil-producing facilities in Saudi Arabia. Reportedly, the attack was carried out with the covert support of Iran, and such a large-scale coordinated attack against one of the world's largest refiners sent a shockwave across the global oil industry. So the terrorism and proxy wars that we witness in the Middle East West Asia region is an extension of the hostile relations between major powers such as United States and Iran, Israel and Iran, Saudi Arabia and Iran, etc. These tensions also affect the supply of oil through the Strait of Hormuz, which is a strategic choke point for global oil supplies. These geopolitical factors have the ability to disrupt the supply and prices of oil that is exported from the Middle East West Asia region. And since a large part of India's imports come from this region, it has a direct impact on India's energy security. Upon these geopolitical factors, the COVID-19 pandemic has again exposed India's vulnerability to such external supply shocks and pricing shocks. So in order to shield India's energy security from such external shocks, the government of India is looking to diversify its sources of oil imports. Instead of relying excessively on Middle Eastern and West Asian countries, India is looking to source oil from other major producers as well, such as Russia, because Russia has massive reserves of crude oil and natural gas in its Far East region, and India is looking to jointly exploit this in collaboration with Russia. India is also looking to tap into the shale gas reserves of the United States. Today, the US has emerged as a major energy producer because of its massive shale gas reserves, and India is looking to capitalize upon its good relations with the United States in order to diversify its energy sources. Apart from this, India has also begun to source oil and energy from various key producers in Africa and Latin America, such as Nigeria, Venezuela, etc. But of course, importing oil and energy from these countries is going to be more expensive as a result of transportation and logistics cost as compared to the cheaper imports that comes in from West Asia and Middle East. But the diversification of energy sources is very much needed in order to make India's energy security more secure and shield it from being so vulnerable to external supply shocks, especially to those caused by geopolitical factors. Now let's take up a column from page number 7, which has been written by Mr. Rajiv Kumar, who is the Vice Chairman of the Niti Aayog. This column evaluates the 20 lakh crore economic stimulus package that was announced by the government as a part of the Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan that was announced by the Prime Minister. Over the last few days, we have come across a number of articles, editorials and columns that have criticized the economic stimulus package for being insufficient because the actual fiscal expenditure for the government is very low and most of the package is comprised of liquidity measures and cheaper loans. The government has also been criticized for including RBI's monetary policy initiatives and repackaged variants of existing schemes under the package. So on this basis, experts have criticized the economic stimulus package because according to them, it does not offer any immediate relief either to the common man or to the industry. Often, comparisons have been drawn between India's meager economic stimulus package and the trillion-dollar packages that have been announced by the United States and other European countries. So in this context, the writer makes a counter argument. According to the writer, the economic package is a well-balanced stimulus package considering India's limited resources, and its design is expected to minimize the human cost of the COVID-19 pandemic and pave the path for structural reforms. See, the writer says that it is unfair to compare India's economic package with that of the United States because the United States nearly has unlimited natural and financial resources, and moreover, its currency, the dollar, enjoys the status and power of a global reserve currency. These factors allows the United States to issue unlimited debt in order to finance a massive trillion-dollar plus package without having to worry about the impact of such debt financing and increased fiscal expenditure on its macroeconomy, and without having to worry much about its fiscal deficit and inflation. Because the financial depth of the US economy allows the US government and its Federal Reserve to deal with the long-term macroeconomic consequences of financing such a large relief package. The writer says that this is a luxury that can't be afforded by India. India being an emerging economy, its financial resources are limited, but the writer feels that the government has done a fantastic job within its limited potential. According to the writer, the economic package has been designed to take into account the human cost of the pandemic and the human suffering that has been caused by the pandemic and the lockdown. The writer says that the economic package does have sufficient provisions to provide for immediate relief to the citizens and the common man, especially to the vulnerable and weaker sections. Apart from this, the economic package has been designed to make use of the opportunity created by the pandemic and the lockdown to introduce bold structural reforms that were pending for a while in order to power India's growth in the long term. So basically, the economic package has been designed by keeping these two objectives in mind. The first and primary objective is to ease and minimize the human cost of the pandemic and reduce human suffering. And second is to make use of this opportunity and push through bold structural reforms that could power India's economic growth for the coming years. The writer says that the economic stimulus package has been designed to address both demand and supply side challenges that have been created by the pandemic and the lockdown. See, we all know very well that the lockdown has completely disrupted the demand-supply equation in the economy. First, if we talk about demand, the lockdown has affected consumer behavior and consumption patterns. For example, people are no longer watching movies at the theater. They are no longer eating out at restaurants and hotels. They are no longer taking vacations, and they are not buying sufficient consumer products and goods such as cars, electronic gadgets, etc. So as a result of this change in demand and consumption behavior at the consumer level, demand in the entire industry comprising of agriculture, manufacturing and services has been completely disrupted. So the demand-led disruption caused to the industry and the restrictions of the lockdown has posed a supply side challenge as well. The writer says that to deal with such a massive disruption to demand and supply, we need to look at the demand-supply equation in a more holistic manner. See, for example, we generally assume demand to be consumer demand alone. But the writer says that such an assumption ignores the demand created through investments and intermediate goods. According to the writer, demand in the economy is not just made up of consumers' demand for consumer products, goods and services, but it also includes the demand for investment in newer industries, and as well as the demand for intermediate goods and services from industries and businesses that are dependent on each other. The writer says that the economic stimulus package must be appreciated because it takes into account all the three types of demands. The package has been designed to address and support consumer demand, investment demand, and the demand for intermediate goods. See, for increasing consumer demand, you need to increase the purchasing power of the consumer by putting more money into their hands through direct cash transfers. The writer says that the economic stimulus package has done this by providing for cash transfer to female Jan Dhan account holders. The government is trying to increase the purchasing power of the salaried class by providing for deductions in taxes, contribution for employee provident fund, etc. It is trying to increase purchasing power and consumer demand in the rural areas by providing for an additional allocation of 40,000 crore rupees under Manrega. It is also trying to put more money in the hands of construction workers and farmers through existing schemes and policies such as PM Kisan, the Construction Workers Welfare Fund, etc. So if these measures have been designed to take care of consumer demand and increase the purchasing power of the consumer, then sufficient measures have also been included in the relief package in order to revive investment demand and demand for intermediate goods. The writer says that this has been done by providing for additional liquidity and easier loans for the MSME sector, and this should help drive up demand for investments and intermediate goods. The writer expects the relief package to revive industrial activities in the MSME sector and create further demand for investments and intermediate goods. Next, the writer explains how the economic relief package tries to revive supply and economic activities by targeting the four key pillars of the economy. This includes the farmers, the businesses and companies that are facing a cash crunch, private producers, and the street vendors. See, in order to protect the well-being of the farmers and the country's food security, the relief package has provided for an increased and efficient procurement of the Rabi crops that have been harvested. So this not only protects the livelihood of farmers, but it also addresses the supply side imbalances in the agriculture sector. Then a number of measures have been announced in order to help out businesses and companies that are facing a cash crunch as a result of the pandemic and the lockdown. For example, the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code has been diluted in order to prevent the initiation of insolvency and bankruptcy proceedings against failed businesses. Then the loan moratorium that has been announced by the RBI should help out a number of businesses and industries that are dealing with a cash crunch. This allows the industries and the businesses to defer their debt service obligations and use the available cash to pay salaries, to run their operations, and to revive their production so that the business could be kept alive. Then to help out the power distribution companies or DISCOMs that have been dealing with a massive financial crisis, the government has announced a relief package of 90,000 crore rupees. So this credit package is expected to help out DISCOMs to clear their pending dues and reduce their financial burden. Then private producers are being supported by the economic stimulus package through a series of liberalization policies that is expected to introduce bold structural reforms into the economy. For example, the liberalization policies in agriculture would provide greater freedom to farmers to choose their clients. Then the relaxation of the Essential Commodities Act is expected to allow traders and exporters to maintain adequate stocks of agro products in order to support their export obligations. Earlier, the outdated Essential Commodities Act was restricting stock holding in the name of preventing hoarding. But the relaxation of these outdated provisions will allow traders and exporters to stockpile on agro products in order to meet their export obligations. Then further, the liberalization introduced in the defense production sector and the increase in the FDI limit is expected to promote indigenization and self-reliance in the defense manufacturing sector. Plus, the structural reforms that have been introduced will also help private businesses to challenge the monopoly that has been enjoyed by public sector enterprises. This will not only help promote competition and bring benefits to the consumer, but it will also push the public sector enterprise to either reform or perish. Then finally, the economic stimulus package provides relief to street vendors by providing for a 10,000 rupee credit for restocking. See, street vendors play a key role in the demand economy by helping to fulfill the demand of the consumer. So helping them to restock through a credit line of 10,000 rupees will help in initiating the supply chain to fulfill the consumer demand. So in conclusion, the writer feels that the government of India has done a very good job of balancing both demand and supply side challenges that have been created by the pandemic and the lockdown. And he praises the economic stimulus package for being a well-balanced stimulus package that has been designed to minimize the human cost of the pandemic and pave the path for structural reforms. Now let's take up another column from page number 7. This column evaluates how the world of data should evolve in the post-COVID-19 world. See, we have discussed over the last few months how data-driven technologies have been used by governments and organizations around the world in order to battle the COVID-19 pandemic. So in a world where data-driven technologies are gaining significance, the writers evaluate the underlying geopolitics which can influence data privacy and data sharing. See, as COVID-19 spread, China led the way in deploying emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence and data analysis to contain the spread of the disease. Then governments around the world deployed a number of data-driven technologies such as contact tracing apps that collect and analyze intimate user data such as the user's location. And the best example for this would be India's Arogya Setu app. So this is just one example of how governments around the world are increasing their dependency on data-driven technologies, and this is increasing their desire to have greater control over such data and over such technologies. Then apart from governments, we have private technology companies, especially the big tech companies such as Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, etc., which are also excessively dependent on such data-driven technologies. Now, an interesting power play is emerging between governments and these big tech companies. Because earlier, the tech companies were dependent on government support. But today, due to the global reach of big tech companies and the control that they have on user data, governments around the world are being forced to rely upon private technology companies such as the big tech. And this increasing conflict for control over data between different governments and between governments and private agencies is posing a greater risk for an individual's privacy and is increasing geopolitical tensions. The ongoing geopolitical conflict and trade war between China and the United States over the rollover of 5G technology by Huawei networks is a classic example for this. Both the governments are interested in increasing their control over an emerging technology that is driven by data. Similarly, the desire of private big tech companies to increase their control over data and establish their monopoly is a threat for privacy, and it could have geopolitical ramifications. The Internet.org initiative and the Free Basics initiative of Facebook is an example for this. So on one side, if different governments are locked in a geopolitical conflict, on the other hand, governments are trying to take away the excessive control that private tech companies are enjoying in order to increase their own control over user data, which could amount to the violation of privacy of the individual. So in short, it is right to say that data is the new gold or the new oil. See, there is no doubt that data-driven emerging technologies can promote people's welfare, provided if there are adequate legal mechanisms in place to promote data sharing with the user and to protect the individual's data privacy. See, in the conflict involving governments and private organizations over data control, we have one government which is pushing another government to share data. Then we have governments that are pushing organizations to share data. But curiously, this conflict involving governments and private organizations has completely ignored sharing data with the user. At the end of the day, it should be the user who should be given the individual right to exercise control over his data, and his data privacy can be ensured only by legal mechanisms that pushes governments and private organizations to share this data with the user. Right now, a number of governments, including the Indian government, they have been pushing for data protection laws that is prioritizing data localization. Through data localization laws, these governments are pushing the private companies to establish local servers in order to increase the government's control over citizens' data. There are other governments which are pushing private companies to introduce weaker encryption technologies through data protection laws. Their desire is to increase their surveillance on user data in the name of national security and tackling threats such as terrorism. So some of these controversial data protection laws have increased conflicts between governments and private tech companies. The whole question is about who should exercise control over data storage and data processing. While governments and companies are fighting for this control, they are ignoring the user who should be enjoying this right to control his data. But however, on the positive side, few Western countries have proposed new legislations that are seeking to increase the control of the user over his data. For example, we have European Union's General Data Protection Regulation and the Cloud Act of the United States, which allows the user to have a greater control over how his data would be shared, stored and processed. But even these policies have issues with regard to data localization and cross-border flow of information. Even if you look at India's proposed data protection law, objections have been raised by foreign governments and private companies over the data localization provisions that have been proposed by the Indian government. The concern with regard to data localization requirements and government regulation of cross-border flow of information is that it seeks to enhance the control of the government over the flow and storage of data, and this increases the chances of state surveillance and the violation of individuals' privacy. So in this context, the writers argue that in a world where governments and companies are fighting over data control, data sharing with the user should be prioritized. They argue that in a post-COVID-19 world, where the dependency on data-driven technologies is likely to increase, governments and private corporations, they need to work towards establishing digital equity. The writers say that in a post-COVID-19 world, there is a need to distinguish between individual data and large data sets such as big data or global data. It is true that data-driven technologies that make use of global data sets can transform governance and can promote people's welfare, and it can help in creating a level playing field. For example, we have seen how data-driven technologies can help in curbing the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic. But the need to exploit global data sets should not allow governments or private organizations to violate an individual's right to privacy over his data. So the writers say that in a post-COVID-19 world, digital equity has to be established through legal mechanisms, and these legal mechanisms should place restrictions on governments and private entities from unnecessarily interfering with or controlling individual data. Now let's take up an article from page number 10. The International Labour Organization has urged Prime Minister Modi to not dilute labour laws in the name of reviving economic growth and industrial activities. This reminder from the ILO has come in the backdrop of the dilution of labour laws that were introduced by a few state governments and the centre in order to promote economic and industrial activities that had been brought to a standstill as a result of the lockdown and the pandemic. In previous sessions, we have discussed in detail as to how the dilution of labour laws proposed by few state governments and the centre might affect labour welfare. And in the interest of the labourers, the International Labour Organization has urged Prime Minister Modi to reconsider the dilution of labour laws and uphold India's commitments to international law. Next, on page number 11, The Hindu carries an interview with Mr. Santosh K. Mehrotra, who happens to be a senior professor at JNU. And in this interview, Mr. Santosh talks about the reverse migration which has been caused by the lockdown and its long-term economic impact. Since we have held sufficient discussions on the long-term consequences of reverse migration, I would request you to go through this article once, which is largely factual, because it could help in your mains answer writing. Now let's take up an article from page number 16. A new species of fish has been discovered in the sacred pilgrimage town of Velankani in Tamil Nadu by a team of researchers from Kerala. They have named this fish as Puntius sanctus, and it is a small freshwater fish that belongs to the family Cyprinidae. This freshwater fish is very small in size and it only grows to a length of around 7 centimeters, and it is consumed as food and as well as used in aquariums. See, the Puntius species of fish is referred to as Paral in Kerala and Kende in Tamil Nadu. The newly discovered fish has been named as Sanctus because in Latin it translates to holy. This is a reference to the pilgrimage status that Velankani enjoys where the fish was discovered. See, the Velankani town is a coastal town in the Nagapattinam district of Tamil Nadu. In the ancient times, it was a busy commercial port that had established trading linkages with the Roman and Greek civilization. Due to this connection of Velankani with Christian Europe, Roman Catholic Latin shrines took root, and we have the Basilica of Our Lady of Good Health, which is a popular pilgrimage site for Christians that symbolizes the heritage of Gothic architecture in India. Now let's take up the practice questions for today. Which of the following statements are correct? The ban and action against people burning stubble or crop residue is regulated under the Air Prevention and Control of Pollution Act 1981. Stubble burning reduces soil fertility besides polluting the environment. The Parliament enacted the Air Act in 1981 to fulfill India's commitment to the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment held at Stockholm, where the Stockholm Declaration was adopted in 1972. All the three statements are correct, so option D is the right answer. Now let's take up the next practice question. Which of the following statements are correct? Paddy cultivation is said to be one of the most water intensive crops. The crop requires flooded soil for its growth, and it suppresses weed growth and increases the uptake of nutrients from the soil for better yield. Due to the environmental impact of water intensive crops, crop diversification is promoted by the government through incentives and favorable minimum support price. All the three statements are correct. Option D is the right answer. Now let's take up the next practice question. Which of the following statements are correct with regard to Down syndrome? It is also known as trisomy 21. It is a contagious disease caused by a bacteria. It is usually associated with physical growth delays, mild to moderate intellectual disability, and characteristic facial features. Amongst the given statements, the second statement is incorrect. So option D is the right answer. See, Down syndrome is a genetic disorder. It is not a contagious bacterial disease. Now let's take up the next practice question. Which of the following statements are correct? Before 1971, abortion was criminalized in India under Section 312 of the Indian Penal Code of 1860. The Medical Termination of Pregnancy Act 1971 legalized abortion and provided for termination of pregnancy within 20 weeks. Recently, the Lok Sabha has passed the Medical Termination of Pregnancy Amendment Bill 2020 that seeks to reduce the termination of pregnancy period from 20 weeks to 12 weeks in order to restrict abortion rights and the reproductive rights of women. Amongst the given statements, the third statement is incorrect. Because the Medical Termination of Pregnancy Amendment Bill, which was recently passed by the Lok Sabha, does not reduce the termination of pregnancy period. Instead, it extends it from 20 weeks to 24 weeks. So this proposed bill does not restrict abortion rights and reproductive rights of women. Instead, it promotes abortion rights and it promotes the reproductive rights of women. So since the third statement is incorrect, the correct answer is option B, 1 and 2 only. In this context, I want you to go through these provisions which explain how the Medical Termination of Pregnancy Act of 1971 decriminalized abortion and allowed for abortion to be carried out within 12 weeks of pregnancy and between 12 to 20 weeks of pregnancy. I want you to go through these conditions and also look at the provisions of the proposed amendment bill. The proposed amendment bill plans to extend the termination period from 20 weeks to 24 weeks. Now let's take up another practice question. Which of the following statements are correct? IPS probationers are trained at the Premier Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel National Police Academy located in Mussoorie. Earlier, new entrants to the IPS were trained at the Central Police Training College in Mount Abu, located in Rajasthan, which was established in 1948. The idea of setting up such a training institution for IPS was Sardar Patel's brainchild. The National Police Academy shifted from Mount Abu to one central location based on the recommendations of the Dharamveer Commission. Amongst the given statements, the first and the fourth statements are incorrect. So option C is the right answer. See, based on Sardar Patel's recommendation in 1948, the Central Police Training College was established at Mount Abu in Rajasthan to train IPS probationers. But later in 1971, the Gore Committee recommended the shifting of the National Police Academy from Mount Abu to one central location. And as per this recommendation, the Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel National Police Academy has been established at Hyderabad. Now let's take up the next practice question. Which of the following statements are correct? Dasa Sahitya is a part of Bhakti movement seen in Tamil literature. It was composed by devotees of Lord Vishnu or one of his avatars. Dasas, which literally translates to slaves, are Dvaita scholars and poets, and a few popular ones include Purandara Dasa, Haridasa, Kanakadasa, etc. Purandara Dasa is hailed as the father figure of Carnatic music. Amongst the given statements, the first statement is incorrect. So the correct answer is option C, 2, 3 and 4 only. See, Dasa Sahitya is a part of the Bhakti movement seen in Kannada literature, not Tamil literature. Now let's take up a practice question from the 2016 prelims paper. Which one of the following is the purpose of the Uday scheme? The correct answer is option D. Its main purpose is to provide for financial turnaround and revive the power discoms or the power distribution companies. Finally, let's take up a couple of mains practice questions. The first question, oil prices in India have remained high during the COVID-19 pandemic despite the slump in global prices. Examine. The second question, critically examine the geopolitical issues underlying technology and data in the era of the pandemic. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. So this concludes our discussion for the day. Thanks for watching.